All right, it looks like we are live. If we are, I see I have the chat open. So if you want to give some confirmation there that you're getting the stream and that you're getting a good sound from the microphone, give me a thumbs up when you get a chance. Welcome to our live stream here on YouTube. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. We've already had a couple of videos loaded up today. If you haven't checked that out, we had a really good one on Greece. I have been waiting for Greece to finally turn to the nationalist populist right. It's been a long time coming, and they're finally there. They're finally getting there. There's a coalition in the making between the party known as the New Democracy, which is getting the highest percentage of approval right now for their upcoming elections. And is it October of 2019? They are polling around 40%. Syriza's fading. I mean, they're down in some polls by as much as 20% from New Democracy. But New Democracy, it seems, is ready to coalition with Golden Dawn. And we may have a nationalist populist government in Greece by the end of the year, may even be sooner if they have a snap election. Things are not going very, very well for the Syriza administration. So anyway, that was very, very exciting. And I just put that up this afternoon, so you may want to check that out. All right, let's see. So how's the mic working? And say hello from everybody. UK, excellent. We're going to be talking about C.S. Lewis today and this evening here, my time in the U.S., must be a bit, what is it? Must be around midnight in the UK. Good evening, Doc from Connecticut. Thanks, Catspaw. Awesome. Yeah, my old stomping ground. Do I have anything to say about Sweden? Oh, my. Well, we'll see. We'll see. Isn't the vote tomorrow to bring Lufen back? We'll see. We'll see what goes on. If, just real quick, I guess this is our warm-up session as we're getting cozy here. So Sweden right now, if the new coalition goes, the center coalition, center left, center right coalition goes, I think it's fundamental proof that all center left, center right parties are fundamentally the same. They are globalist parties. They operate by the same paradigm, and what the Sweden Democrats represents a fundamentally different paradigm that Sweden right now wants nothing to do with. It's obviously the most liberal nation among the Nordic nations. Denmark, Norway, Finland, even if you start crossing the channel, as it were, Estonia, Latvia, they're all going nationalist populist right. But Sweden is a holdout there. So it looks like the Sweden Democrats are going to have to go another round of elections to really push up their numbers. At the regional level, I did a video on this. At the regional level, Sweden Democrats are doing great. There are districts in Sweden right now that are basically just overwhelmed with support for Sweden Democrats. So they're really working quite well at the local level and forming coalitions and the like. But the national level, it is very clear globalization is alive and well within the Sweden parliament, and they want nothing to do with the challenge to that. So we'll see what happens tomorrow. A party may still get cold feet and break away, but I think it's so unfair to the voters, the majority of voters who voted for a center-right coalition to put Lufen back into as prime minister. I mean, they voted against him, and then to turn around and do this, I think it's really tragic. I think people want the center-right to work with the Sweden Democrats. And then they're going to have, if that's the case, they're going to have a coalition strong enough. If the trajectories keep going, they'll have a coalition that's strong enough to last well over the next decade. Look at what's going on in Switzerland with the Swiss People's Party. They've been dominant now for how long? I think since 2007. So over 10 years now. Viktor Orban and his 3 terms. This is, and just look at the approval ratings for Matteo Salvini and Lega Nord is by far, and Lega Nord, they're the North Italian League now. They are by far the #1 polling party, by far, for the upcoming European election. So I don't know what the center right is thinking in Sweden, other than just being mixed up with being addicted to globalization. So there you go. You got me. Look at that. You got me going there. All right, let's see. We have a number of people coming on in. Looks great. So, and everyone can see me, and you can hear me, right? So let's dive in here. Let's dive into our reading, because I think it's very interesting. We had a lot to cover. And what I want to do tonight, and first off, by the way, I do want to thank all of our Patreon supporters, particularly our VIP patrons. And I want to thank our Turley Talks Insider members for making this possible. Not just Patreon, but Subscribestar as well. It does look like, I don't know if you've been following the whole fiasco with Subscribestar, but it does look like Subscribestar has finally gotten a solution to payment processing. They haven't been able to take any new subscribers. You notice I have been mentioning it in the videos. And that's largely because PayPal, in effect, shut them down. PayPal refused, as I understand it at least, to process their payments. So they didn't have a payment processor. So it's been taking several weeks, but it looks like, I got a note, it looks like they're ready to be up and running again and take more subscribers. So we'll see. We'll take a look. I'll keep you updated. But again, a huge thanks to all of you who support this, make this possible. I can't do it without you, and you mean more to me than anything than any words are even possible of expressing. So thank you very much. So let's dive in. What I want to do this evening is I want to explore with you what the renowned Oxford scholar C.S. Lewis, who I'm sure you probably know from Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe back in the day, right? The Narnia Chronicles series. I mean, he wrote in every genre imaginable. He was an extraordinary scholar. I want to dive into actually more or less his predictions of globalization. It was absolutely fascinating. He saw, when writing, say, 1944, he saw a world very much like what we've been seeing, this massive, interlocking mechanism of technology and telecommunications that creates a single political and economic worldwide system, right? He saw that coming. He saw the two classes. He saw a transnational elite ruling over nations, cultures, customs, and traditions that suddenly have to subsume their nations, cultures, customs, and traditions, their historic practices and identity to the protocols and to the norms of this aristocratic elite. He saw that from back while World War II was going on. And I want to get into why he was seeing that. I want to get into what his cure is. I want to get into, I think that's extremely important. I'm going to just go straight for it here. Why I think Lewis is so amazing is he not only diagnoses globalization from before it even manifests itself, say in the 1970s and 80s. Not only that, but what Lewis does is he gives us a cure. He shows us, as it were, the way back. And the beauty is it's happening. We're in the midst of it right now. We're doing it, which is really cool. It's technically known something as retraditionalization, involves nationalism, populism, and the like. But we'll get into specifically his cure. And I think it's so important because as well as what the situation in Sweden is demonstrating, is a situation, say, among our ridiculously inept Republican Party, the neocon side of the Republican Party demonstrates here in the States, as we're seeing among the conservatives in Britain and Australia. If we're not careful, what we end up doing is we end up defending yesterday in light of today, as I've heard it put. We end up, to be a conservative means we're defending yesterday in light of today. So liberals want to go off into the brave new world of tomorrow. And we're doing everything we can to hold them back. Saying, no, we don't want to go there. We want to defend the way things were, within the last 24 hours, as it were. But inevitably, because of globalization, inevitably tomorrow comes. And after a few tomorrows, if that's our strategy, what do we end up doing? Well, after a few tomorrows, we end up actually defending a yesterday that several yesterdays ago we were rejecting, right? Does that make sense? I'll give you an example. For years, several years leading up to now, the Republican Party here was absolutely opposed to transgender rights, right? And one of the big things that Republicans were passing, particularly at state levels, local levels, is something called bathroom bills. They were requiring transgenders to use the bathrooms of their gender that's on their birth certificate, not something of their choice, something objective, something biological and the like. Now, of course, that's been called, homophobia and the like, and hateful and whatnot. But Republicans were pretty much united in that effort to try to hold the line of transgenderism. When President Trump announced his ban on transgenders serving in the military, which is still active right now, God bless him, when he announced that, Johnny Ernst, who is the supposedly conservative senator from Iowa, immediately came out and opposed him and said she was absolutely going to defend transgenders serving in the military. You see, this is the problem if we think the way to solve globalization is to simply defend yesterday in light of today. Inevitably, after a few tomorrows, we're going to end up defending what we rejected a few yesterdays ago. What Lewis is telling us here, and what's going to make him so powerful in this lesson here, is he's telling us we do not oppose effectively globalization by being globalized light, like, say, the center right in Sweden, right? By being globalized light. We oppose globalization by offering something fundamentally different. We oppose globalization by going post-global, which for Lewis, ironically, as I'm sure you probably figured out, many of you know him, which for Lewis meant we go, in effect, pre-global. We go back to the way we were doing human life for thousands of years. And that's not like going back to the past. I think it was the Russian scholar Alexander Dugin who pointed this out. And we'll go through it as we'll discover this as we're going through C.S. Lewis's work. When we go back to our traditions, our customs, our religions, and the like, we're not going back to some, idealistic past. We're actually going back to the notion of encountering eternity daily in our lives, collectively as a people. We're going back to encountering eternity, and therefore every day is renewed, as it were. Eternity involves the past, the future, and the present. I love the Apostle Paul's statement about the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. As often as you eat of this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes again. This is the Eucharistic moment. Did you notice the threefold temporal overlap there? As often as you eat of this bread and drink of this cup, now you proclaim the Lord's death in the past until he comes again in the future. This is what a retraditionalized nationalist populist movement involves. It involves coming back to a conception of time that involves eternity, and therefore connects us with our past, but always is being renewed for a vibrant and flourishing future so that we can live faithful lives in the present. That's what Lewis is calling us to. So there is a kind of a nutshell right there. Okay, now you can go home now, right? Turn it off. We're all done, right? Now, come on, we've got some work to do here. So let's go through this a little bit. The book that I'm going to be deferring to is the book. Let's see if the light is there. If I can, Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. The Abolition of Man. I have several editions, as you can see. I teach it every year at my classical school. There are several different editions. They're pretty cheap. You can get it online via Amazon. I do have a little primer, what we're going to be going through tonight, called Classical versus Modern Education, a Vision from C.S. Lewis. And a lot of what we're covering, we're going to go beyond this, actually. But if you want a little primer on what we're talking about tonight, this would be really good for you as well. There will be a link on that, I'm sure, on the website or on one of our videos. So we're going to look at his writing of The Abolition of Man. I studied at Durham University, which is one of the most beautiful little towns on the planet. I miss it so much. That's where I did my doctorate. And C.S. Lewis delivered these lectures that turned into his book, The Abolition of Man, at Durham. I didn't know that until I did some research here. He actually did it at a satellite campus, I believe, in Newcastle, right? Which is, if I recall, is an hour north, not quite an hour north, 40 minutes north of Durham. But nevertheless, he tells this wonderful story of during World War II, while there were rations going on in London, he took a train, 3 hours north or so to Durham. And that's where there were no rations apparently there. So he just said it was the most refreshing moment for his soul during the bleak years of World War II to just come to this beautiful fairy tale medieval city with its glorious Norman cathedral and the castle right across, and to just sort of breathe beauty and breathe life. And boy, I could tell you, for my dear friends in the UK, I miss that breath. All right. Here's how Lewis starts his work in terms of setting up for us what he means by globalization and his problem of what's going on here, and really what's at the heart of it. He starts his book with a chapter called Men Without Chests. We'll talk about that in a sec. He's not talking about me, but well, maybe, but you know what I mean. And he begins by critiquing the state of British education. Now, this is I think the lectures were in 1942, 43, and then the book was published in 1944. And he's critiquing the state of British high school, secondary education. And he turns our attention to an English textbook, but he never lets us know what the book is. We do now know what it is. It's called The Control of Language, written by Alec King and Martin Ketley. But he called it the Green Book. He didn't want to insult the authors, and he called the authors Gaius and Titius. So he opens up and he says, I was thumbing through this we'll call it the Green Book, a textbook for impressionable British minds, written by Gaius and Titius. And in this English book, the authors recount the very famous visit by Samuel Taylor Coleridge to the waterfalls of the Clyde in Scotland. And this is in the 1800s, early 1800s. And as Coleridge stood before these waterfalls, he overheard two different assessments from other pilgrims, shall we say. And one said, "How sublime," to which Coleridge says, "Yes, yes." And then he heard somebody else say, "How pretty." And Coleridge just said, "Oh, that's not the appropriate adjective," right? And so Gaius and Titius comment on this scene. And here's what they write. And this is what Lewis is very concerned about. When the man said, "That is sublime," he appeared to be making a remark about the waterfall. Actually, he was not making a remark about the waterfall, but a remark about his own feelings. What he was saying was really, I have feelings associated in my mind with the word sublime, or shortly, I have sublime feelings. This confusion is continually present in language as we use it. We appear to be saying something very important about something, and actually, we're only saying something about our feelings. Now, what struck Lewis as so fascinating here is he saw this scene as a microcosm of this like grand cosmic battle that was coming before us. On the one side is Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He looks at the waterfall and he sees a world filled with divine meaning and purpose. And that divine meaning and purpose is supposed to elicit an appropriate response. I'm supposed to love the beauty of that waterfall. That's why it was created for me, as it were, right? On the other side, you have Gaius and Titius. Gaius and Titius see the world as devoid of any divine meaning and purpose, but is made up solely of biology, chemistry, and physical, biological, chemical, physical, causal laws. And there's no meaning to it whatsoever, apart from the meaning that I choose to impart to it. Beauty is entirely located within my cranium or within my sternum, wherever you want to put it. Beauty is a subjective mental category that then I impose upon purely natural, biological, chemical, and physical processes. And then sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that that value, that beauty that I impose on otherwise meaningless processes, we sometimes get confused and think that that meaning, that purpose, that value actually exists out there, but it doesn't. It's blind nature. It has no meaning. It has no purpose apart from that which I personally choose to give to it. And what Lewis argued is here we see a clash between two worlds. A world that's fundamentally moral and a world, as it were, that's fundamentally mechanistic. A world that's filled with sapientia, the Latin for wisdom, and a world that's governed solely by scientific rationality and perspective. And Lewis said these worlds are incompatible. One's going to win and the other's going to lose. They cannot coexist. And what he does is he develops what he believes to be the fundamental consequence upon our humanity for the conquering of the scientific, as it were. And he loves science. This is not an anti-science book. He loves science as a servant to understand. He despises it as a master to control. That's an important distinction. Lewis, and I think traditionalists in general, love science. We love science as a servant that seeks to understand, as opposed to a master that seeks to control and to dominate and manipulate. That's the key difference. And Lewis is asking, what happens to the human person? What happens to the student when the student is put into a world of scientific manipulation? And that's what he develops. But first, what he tries to do is he contrasts it. And not tries to do, he does a brilliant job. He contrasts it with what we might call the classical conception of the world. And in a classical conception of the world, he says this: the task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, right? To be cynical and flippant. Oh, you can't believe that anymore. Nobody who's rational believes that. The task of the modern educator is not to be flippant and cynical. It's not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. The right defense against false sentiments is not to inculcate just sentiments. By starving the sensibility of our pupils, we only make them easier prey to the propaganda when he comes. For famished nature will be avenged, and hard heart is no infallible protection against a soft head. Now, what Lewis is getting at is he is arguing that classical education, which is what he was as a professor of Oxford and Cambridge, he was a representative of the education that marked Greek society, Roman society into Byzantium and the Holy Roman Empire, Christian society, well into the Protestant period, Puritans and the like. He represented this classical notion of the world and of education. And what was this classical notion of the world and of education? Very important for us, just in general, in terms of us living our lives in a way that by which we can flourish in the midst of a waning but very cranky and angry globalized world. What Lewis argues is that the classical imagination, the classical mind, envisioned the world filled with divine meaning and purpose. Now, scholars call this cosmic piety, and it does appear to be basically ubiquitous. It's everywhere in the so-called ancient world. And I would push that up to literally, if we're calling it classical in the broad sense, 18th century. Okay. It stretches off into today. Most of the world is still enamored with something we call cosmic piety. But the West certainly has lost it, which we'll get into. But this term, cosmic piety, is important. Cosmic piety is the almost universal conception of the world that everything around us is filled with divine meaning and purpose. And therefore, all of us are born into a world of divine obligation. That's really key. We're all born into a world where we are obligated to conform our lives into a harmonious relationship with that divine meaning and purpose so that we can be what we were always meant to be within this divine created order. And in order to bring that about, in order to fulfill that divine obligation, we needed to learn basically two things. And again, whether you're king or pauper, everyone had to learn at their own level at least two things. We had to develop right thinking about the world, understanding the divine meaning and purpose around us. And we had to develop right sentiments towards the world and what we know about the world. That is a right kind of loving of the world as it is meant to be. Right kind of thinking is known as wisdom, and the right kind of loving is known as virtue. So wisdom and virtue are the two, shall we say, like key components to a truly human education. A truly human education involves teaching the student to understand and discern the divine economy of goods in all things, and at the same time to teach the student to love rightly that divine economy of goods. I like, as a way of pointing it out, I like to give my students the example. I probably used it, you might know it, used it with you before, but if I say to them, it's okay, it's good, it's not just okay, it's good to love a baby, and it is good to love a ham sandwich, right? You can love the baby, you can love the ham, but if they're both falling and I rush to rescue the ham sandwich, that's bad. Okay. And of course, my young male students are the ones who always want to say, well, how bad is it? I mean, what kind of ham is it? Is the baby annoying? How far is it falling? I have to convince them, but eventually they get it. Eventually they get that if both are falling and I rush to save the ham sandwich, that's a bad. And it's a bad because a baby is infinitely more valuable than a ham sandwich. This is the discrimination we need to make, right? The good discrimination we need to make between what's called the economy of goods. There are some things that are more important than other things, even although they all may be good. And wisdom is the faculty that we develop to discern that. And then once I discern that, I need to align my loves, my sentiments in accordance with that divine economy of goods. The St. Augustine called it ordo amoris, the ordering of our loves. And this is what Plato and Aristotle that's how they basically define education. Education is learning to love what you ought. It's something I do with my students all the time, my own children all the time. If we are reading, say, a book by Dostoevsky, and they say, this is too long and it's too boring, I don't like it. My response is not to try to sell them like a great globalist salesman, like a pitch man for Dostoevsky. I look at them and say, you don't love this book? You don't like this book? No, I don't like it. And I look at it and say, well, you ought to. You ought to like it. You're obligated to like it because you live in a world not devoid of any meaning or purpose apart from that which you personally choose to give to it, so that I have to then turn around and sell you on why this book is worth your time. No, you and I live in a world filled with divine meaning and purpose, to which we're supposed to conform our lives to. And this book is one of the means by which we are able to fulfill that divine obligation. And therefore, it's not something that's worth our time. It is something of which none of us are worthy. And yet we've received it. It's a gift. So this then leads to sort of the third component. So you've got cosmic piety. You've got wisdom and virtue as the primary characteristics for a fully educated person. And then how do you develop that wisdom and virtue? That's where the classical canon comes in. You probably have heard of the liberal arts. It's a good liberal, right? I get that a lot. I know I get a lot of comments. Turley, remember, liberal's a good thing. I mean, liberal is, freeing the mind from the fall and saying, I know, but the term is basically co-opted now on the left. But classically, liberal arts were the 7 disciplines by which I learned how to know rightly of the world, because those 7 disciplines, and it's grammar, dialectic, rhetoric, arithmetic, music, mathematics, and astronomy. Geometry and astronomy. Oh my, how did I mess that up? But those 7 subjects become mediators of the divine meaning and purpose that's all around us. And then what they do is they give to me eyes to see that economy of goods rightly in grammatical ways, in logical, dialectic ways, reflecting the logos, the one who holds the world together, in rhetorical ways to speak beautifully. That's why sublime is better than it's pretty. In discerning the mathematical proportionality and symmetry to the world, the geometric elements to the world, the musical beauty of the harmony and symphony of the created order, and the overall astronomical concept. We would call it probably physics today. The overall astronomical understanding of the harmony of the world in which we live. These become the 7 lenses through which I am able to see, discern, develop the wisdom that I need to understand the world rightly. And then through the process of studying literature and art and architecture, music and poetry, that's part of in our case, our Western canon, which is our own contribution to this project. Chinese had their contribution, Indians had their contribution, and the like. But this Western canon, by encountering that, I'm able then to align my loves with what's truly lovely and desire what's truly desirable, and hence experience my highest human flourishing. That's our vision of education, okay? That is the classical vision of education. It is not the modern vision. It's not the globalist vision. And that's where C.S. Lewis gets into next. So what happened? What happened with this beautiful vision of education? Well, basically, Lewis argues that via the Enlightenment, and again, the Enlightenment does have some important elements to it. It's not, we don't reject it entirely. I don't think, maybe, I don't know, we'll have to think that through. But in the Enlightenment, a new way of knowing the world sort of took over. And it's complicated. You have a process known as the nationalization of the universities. Perry Glanger over at Baylor University calls it that. That happens in the 17th century. Right after the Treaties of Westphalia, and you have the development of nation states, and churches were basically the ones overseeing universities, by and large. And after the Treaties of Westphalia, government bureaucrats started taking over more universities, and then they started churning out students to be administrators, bureaucrats, and the like. And theology just wasn't that important anymore. It lost sort of its central place and concern. So that set up then the 18th century and its redefinition of knowledge. And there we find that knowledge gets redefined in terms of method, particularly the scientific method. And it became commonplace to put forward the notion that anything that flunked the scientific method, or anything that was impervious to it, like meaning, right, purpose, love, God, theology, all that, anything that could not be put under a microscope, as it were. So anything that flunked the test or was impervious to the test, was now excluded from the realm of what can be known. It was turned now solely into personal opinion. So now you see the emergence of a new conception of knowledge. Historically speaking, knowledge came under two categories, scientia and theoria. So scientia was the understanding of the world so as to be able to solve problems. That's our modern day university majors today. So whenever you ask what's your major, you're basically asking what problem are you solving? Is it a legal problem? Is it a medical problem? Is it an accounting problem? What problem are you solving? And that's why when somebody looks at you, when you say, what's your major in college? And they say, well, I'm a philosopher. You kind of look at them a minute and go, okay, well, what are you going to do with that, right? And what problems you say? If anything, you boys are always getting into problems, right? But nevertheless, scientia was a problem-solving way of knowing. A second form of knowledge was theoria, and theoria was the wisdom. It was being able to, it literally means to see. It's Greek word for sight. It's being able to see, to discern the divine meaning and purpose inherent in the world around us. It's being able to see, for example, an instrument of Roman torture where people were crucified on in order to keep them compliant with the empire of that day. It's able to see that wooden instrument of torture and death and execution transfigure into the tree of life. It's that capacity to see. That's theoria. And that's why we read, I put up a little something. Lewis said, someday we'll get old enough to start reading fairy tales again. Lewis believed fairy tales taught us theoria in the most magnificent sense. That's why we did A Christmas Carol together last month, just before Christmas. A Christmas Carol teaches us how to view the world anew. And that's the area, and filled with divine meaning and purpose, so we can live enriched lives. As a result of the nationalization of the universities in the 17th century and the redefinition of knowledge in the 18th century, theoria was basically sliced out of the program. It was no longer a basis of knowledge. Now, scientia is the one true way of knowing. And then that leads into the 19th century Industrial Revolution, which then creates eventually over time globalization. So what Lewis says is by changing the conception of knowledge, we literally change the conception of the world. We no longer believe in a world that's filled with divine meaning and purpose. Now we see the world solely as made up of biology, chemistry, and physics, right? Solely biological, chemical, and physical causal laws that have no inherent meaning to them, apart from the meaning we choose to give to them. And then when we start developing the technologies of the 19th century, you begin to see the ideology, the philosophy, as it were, of globalism develop. And here's how Lewis understood it. And this is brilliant. I think it's probably the best explanation for the difference between, say, the classical conception of the world and this modernist globalist conception of the world. For the classical mind, for the classical person, the fundamental question was, how do I conform my soul to the divine meaning and purpose around me? And what was the answer? The answer was through prayer and virtue and wisdom. Modern man asks a fundamentally different question. Modern man is not interested in conforming his soul to the divine meaning and purpose around, because he doesn't believe there's any more divine meaning and purpose. He's defined it out of the realm of knowledge. That's just a mere opinion. It's a mere sentiment. Instead, modern man asks the question, how do I conform meaningless nature to my own desires and my own ambitions? And of course, the answer is not wisdom and virtue. That's not going to help you. Instead, the answer is tapping into those mechanisms that operate by the dynamics of power, namely science, technology, and the state, a state completely unhinged from any moral limitations put upon it, say, by the church. And so that's the fundamental difference. It's a brilliant, brilliant way of thinking, of mapping out his, in broad strokes, history. Classical man asked the question, how do I conform my soul to the divine meaning and purpose around me? The answer was through prayer, through wisdom, through virtue. Modern man asked, how do I conform the world around me to my own desires and ambitions? And I do so by tapping into those mechanisms that operate by the dynamics of power, science, technology, state, right? Manipulation. So that's why for Lewis, the classical world, for all of its flaws, for all of its problems, that's for us to have an in-house debate on, right? And discussion on, to make the world better within a cosmic piety framework. In the classical world is a moral world, whereas the modern world by its nature is manipulative. The modern world by its nature is manipulative. Do you catch that? Because fundamentally, the question is, how do I manipulate reality? How do I manipulate nature to my own desires and my own ambitions? Do you now see why people are acting the way they're acting? Do you now see why people are having the surgeries that they're having? Do you now see where transgenderism is coming from and the like? It's all about manipulating physical, material reality to my own desires and my own ambitions. And this is what makes Lewis so brilliant. Because Lewis argues then, if that's the case, if we're going to enter into a world, a new world order, as it were, in Huxley's term, that has manipulation at the heart of its self-conception, then eventually, we're going to get two classes of people. You don't have to be a genius to figure that out, do you? If manipulation is at the heart of the brave new world on which we're embarking, then by definition, eventually you're going to have two classes of people. Can you guess what they are? Manipulators and manipulatees, right? Lewis calls them conditioners and the conditioned. And here's the heart of the manipulation. Tell me if is unstable. Should I stop there? The electrons fell asleep. You two broke the conditioning. Uh-oh. Are we back? Are we back? Give me a little amen if we're back here. Back. Excellent. Okay. Yeah, they're trying to shut us down, right? All right. So let's see. Let's put this together again. The genius of the conditioners is the way they are able to convince the masses that their highest happiness is dependent upon the conditioners being in positions of power. And this is because now in a manipulative world, the world operates by technology. And while that may be all fine and dandy, if we're not careful, if we're buying into this modernist conception of life, then technological societies need technocrats and they need technicians. They need people with the expertise to be able to rightly operate the system for maximum benefit. It's called by scholars today, we operate by what are called expert systems, where now we're all differentiated in terms of our own expertise, right? So it's known as specialization and the like. So what we have then is we have experts engineering social conditions in such a way that maximize the ability of conforming the world to my own desires and my own ambitions. Remember, that's a complicated thing to do. I need technocrats in place who are going to be able to do that for me. I need technocrats in place, technicians in place, who are going to be able to effectively manipulate nature to my own desires and my own ambitions. And what Lewis argues is that the genius of the modern age, the genius of globalization, is the way the technocrats have convinced the vast majority of conditioned people, the way that's their conditioning, they have conditioned them to think that their highest happiness and their highest freedoms are bound up with, they're inextricably linked with, the experts being in control. I have to tell you, in Maryland, the state of Maryland, they have a cash assistance card, right? It's basically a food stamps card. And it's like a debit card. And this is our state issued card where they live off of the government. The government pays for their food. Do you know what the name of that card is called? It's called the Independence Card. I always get a kick out of that, right? The dependent class is given a card that's called, which is literally the symbol of their dependency, and it's called independence. That's the genius of the modern age from Lewis's vantage point. The Lewis's vantage point is you're going to have conditioners and conditioned, and as long as this globalized world exists, you're going to have the conditioners always seeking to convince the conditioned that their highest happiness is dependent on the conditioners being in power. Have I not just summarized the European Union and the bullies in Brussels? Have I not just summarized the swamp in Washington, D.C.? You need us. If you get rid of us, chaos will ensue and you will be most unhappy. So this is Lewis's diagnosis of the classical world. And it really has, in a stunning way, come true. And so let's see. Lewis notices something else that's very interesting here. And that is that even although we have rejected the classical age, even though we've rejected it, we still nevertheless seem to operate according to it. We still expect people to be virtuous. We still expect people to be moral. But what we've done is we've cut people off from the cosmic piety that provided the means by which I can conform my life. It provided the model of the wisdom to which my virtue can be ordered so as to be a moral person. We've cut that off. That's gone. So now what's morality? Well, in the end, it's what conditioners tell us it is. That's what morality becomes. Have you ever heard of this phrase, political correctness? What the heck do you think Gillette Razors was doing the other day? It is the technocratic elites telling us what's right and what's wrong, inventing these words like toxic masculinity and the like. They're telling us what is wrong. They're telling us what is right. They invent what's right and what's wrong in accordance with a world that they're governing. And in order to govern that world effectively, they don't just manipulate reality to our own desires and ambitions. They also have to manipulate our desires and ambitions. You see how this is all playing out? This is Lewis. He's absolutely brilliant with this. I think the book is incredible. And Lewis finishes, or one of his major ways of kind of summarizing his argument, is that we've been trying, like King Lear, to have it both ways. To lay down our human prerogative and yet at the same time to retain it. But it's impossible. Either we are rational spirit obliged forever to obey the absolute values of the Tao, the Tao is what he calls the doctrine of objective values, the cosmic piety. He gives it a Chinese name because he wants to show how universal it was. It's so interesting because classical education is, I won't say often, but is sometimes castigated as being, cultural supremacist or white supremacist and the like. And I love reminding people who make those statements that no, classical education was reflective of a classical world. And the classical world believed in cosmic piety. Now, the West had its own canon, its own liberal arts canon that served as a mediator in literature, art, architecture, music, poetry, drama, mathematics, and the like. But of that cosmic piety, but Chinese had theirs, Indians had theirs. This is not something that's specific to any civilization, but was specific to a world, the classical world as over against the modern world. So that's what he meant by the Tao. Either we are rational spirit, obliged forever to obey the absolute values of the Tao, or else we are mere nature, to be kneaded and cut into new shapes for the pleasures of masters who must, by hypothesis, have no motive but their own natural impulses. Only the Tao, only this cosmic piety, this doctrine of objective value, only the Tao provides a common human law of action which can overarch rulers and ruled alike. A dogmatic belief in objective value is necessary to the very idea of a rule which is not tyranny, or an obedience which is not slavery. And that, my dear friends, is what Lewis calls us back to. Lewis is calling us back to that classical vision of life. We are not to give in one whit to the seductive sirens of globalization. We are to offer a fundamentally different conception of the world. Now, globalists are not going to want anything to do with it, but I'll tell you who do or who would want a lot to do with it, and those who have been completely disenfranchised by globalization. It's those who are recognizing how manipulated they're becoming, those who are recognizing that they're being tugged this way and that way by these false emotions and, affective appeals that they recognize are just there to manipulate them. Now, let me give you some good news here. One of the things that Lewis wanted to see come back was something called classical education. And classical education, as you know, I'm involved in. Classical education involves rediscovering an education that focuses a student on the cosmic piety and awakens within the student wisdom and virtue. And we do so through the recovery of truth, goodness, and beauty. Those are the three great cosmic values, as it were. Truth corresponds to sanctifying my mind. Goodness corresponds to sanctifying my heart, my actions, my ethical life. And beauty corresponds to sanctifying my desires, my appetites, my longings. Again, so I love what's truly lovely and I desire what's truly desirable, and hence I'm able to experience human flourishing. Encountering truth, goodness, and beauty through the seven liberal arts, through literature, art, architecture, music, poetry, all kinds of beautiful, Western canon here in this case, I'm able to cultivate even within myself as a teacher a renewed sense of wisdom, of knowledge of the divine economy of goods and all things, and a renewed sense of virtue and aligning my loves with that divine economy of goods. So I love what's truly lovely, desire what's truly desirable, and hence experience human flourishing. The great news is we're living in the midst of a massive classical education renaissance. Let me give you some statistics here to get you excited and pumped up. According to the Association of Classical Christian Schools, which you should go to their website, they're excellent. It is the premier organization for classical education in the United States and I believe increasingly internationally. You may want to check that out and see what they have and to offer, or connections that they have, people that they know, schools that are offering things like this in the UK, throughout Europe and Australia. You want to check that out. According to the Association of Classical Christian Schools membership statistics, there were only 10 classical schools here in the United States in 1994. Now there are upwards of around 500. So there's just been this massive explosion of growth. Student enrollment has gone from like around 17,000 students to over 50,000 students. We're already seeing the effects of this just from a practical vantage point. As of 2015, classical schools had the highest SAT scores, our standardized testings, which I don't care for very much, but at least gives you a metric here. SAT scores, they had the highest in the three categories of reading, math, and writing among all independent, religious, and public schools. We're seeing homeschooling grow astronomically, not just here in the United States, but interestingly in Russia as well. Right now, it's reported that Russia has over 100,000 children studying at home and studying largely conservative classical education. In 2003, there were an estimated 2 million children homeschooled nationwide here in the States, which grew to 2,500,000 in 2009, which represents a 7 to 15% increase per year. There has been a 74% increase over a 10-year period in homeschooling. And we do have some data, this is largely from vendors, that suggests that classical curriculum is either at least half of the curriculum that they sell or even higher. So we're actually seeing classical education take over in the homeschool. The school choice movement here in the state is stronger than ever before. I think it was in 2017, we got our 26th state implementing school choice legislation. So now school choice, being able to get some tax dollars, whether they're in education savings accounts or tax credits or vouchers or the like, whatever it happens to be, that's now being offered in the majority of states in the United States, in at least 26 of the 50 states. You have the charter school movements going on that are adopting classical education, Great Hearts and the like. It is exploding all over the country, and increasingly in the world. There is something called the Rafiki organization in Africa. I believe it's among 10 countries, and they're operating classical schools in Africa that are filled to the brim. We actually have had a number of teachers at our school go out and teach there teach at one of the schools for a month at a time. And our former headmaster was a headmaster out there at one of the classical schools in Ghana for several years as well. So we've seen amazing things going on there. So rest assured, amazing things are happening. Lewis's diagnosis and cure are happening in our time. Yes, we're seeing a very horrific technocratic elite rise up that hates everything traditionalist, everything populist, everything nationalist, everything that involves custom and culture and tradition. And yet we're seeing the massive blowback, the backlash against that. And one of the best ways we're seeing that backlash is in the rise of classical education. Let me finish with a beautiful little quote from John Ruskin, the English art critic, and his description of the purpose of education. Listen to this. I think it's absolutely beautiful. The entire object of true education is to make people not merely do the right things, but enjoy the right things. Not merely industrious, but to love industry. Not merely learned, but to love knowledge. Not merely pure, but to love purity. Not merely just, but to hunger and thirst after justice. This quote always reminds me of that part in the Two Towers of J.R.R. Tolkien, when Sam and Frodo are on their journey, to destroy the ring in the Lord of the Rings. And the movie actually does a very, very nice, Peter Jackson's version does a very, very nice job of this. And at one point, Frodo just looks at Sam and he says, I just can't do this anymore. And Sam says, I know, Mr. Frodo, I know it's so hard. I know this is a burden beyond what you can bear. But Mr. Frodo, it's a lot like the stories we used to read as children. When things were so dark that you forgot what even the light looked like. And it just looked so hopeless. And yet, there were people in those stories that were willing to fight through that darkness. They were willing to go beyond their, total limitation to achieve something that is beyond any words. And Frodo looked at him and said, what is that, Sam? And Sam looked at him and said, that there's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for. That should be on. I should make that as a beautiful monument on the back of my, or on top of my mantle there. There's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for. That's what this education reawakens within our students. That's what's going on in the nationalist, populist, and traditionalist renaissance going on all over the world. People are reawakening to the realization that there is, in the midst of all of the darkness of globalization, there is still good in this world, and it's worth fighting for. All right, everyone. I think that's it. That's a wrap. It's been a good day. Seeing a nice nice chat. Wow, we have a great group. Wow, thank you so much for coming. Again, I want to thank you all for your support of this channel. You mean everything to me. This has been, we had a great ride. Since we did our last YouTube live stream, we did get 100,000 subscribers, and that's just such a great benchmark. I can't thank you enough. We got our little silver, verification check next to the name there. So we're rocking and rolling. This is just great. 2019 is going to be amazing. It's bumpy, right? Remember, we're not going straight up. We're going up, and that's like a roller coaster, but we're getting there. We've been getting there. We're just checking out the party and watching how things go. But make sure focus on retraditionalization in your life. What are the ways you could bring truth, goodness, and beauty into your life on a daily basis through art and literature, architecture, music, poetry, worship, drama, great movies, conservative movies. We need to do that, by the way. We need to start doing conservative movie reviews to see conservative themes in movies. That's going to be something I'm going to have to work on in 2019 for you. Focus on truth, goodness, and beauty. Focus on developing wisdom. Focus on aligning your loves with what you now know in terms of God's economy of goods, so that you can love what's truly lovely, desire what's truly desirable, and experience your ultimate human flourishing. That's what we want for you. All right, everyone. Long day. We're done. God bless. I'll see you next month around the same time, mid-month. Take care and God bless.